Welcome back to Whose Line Is It? Planarcadia, the planet where everything's made up and the jokes don't matter. That's right, the jokes are like the concept of rules within the Phantasmoon game. There's only one rule and it rules them all, and by all I mean none, because there is only one. Our latest quest gave us a ton of answers and a final showdown with Fulwish, but for every answer we received, a new question was raised. So let's not waste any more time faffing about with the intro, because it is time for the first game of the night. What happened in Planarcadia last episode? Well, Himiko and her father reconnected and reconciled. We learned that ever since Graphia sealed Planarcadia and the world on canvas, her descendants were inflicted with the Weathering Curse, which caused the men of the family to succumb to madness while the women frayed and peeled like old paint on older canvas. And this continued until they all withered away and died, typically quite young. Ryusuke had lost his wife to the curse and couldn't bear losing his daughter too, so he spent Himiko's entire childhood traveling the cosmos looking for a cure, only to find her gravestone waiting for him when he returned. He assumed she succumbed to the Weathering Curse, and Himiko even confirms that at some point she did start cracking and peeling, but she somehow managed a miraculous recovery, and then planted her own gravestone and left Planarcadia on the newly repaired Astral Express, because that's a totally normal thing to do. Now, we're not getting any more information on this until at least next patch, because there's nothing about it in the current patch or the previous one, but I have some thoughts on the situation that I'm going to share at the end of the video, so keep it in mind. And with Himiko's family drama mostly settled, Asheville and the Nameless made their way over to Perlux Corp, where they met with the stars of the hit daytime hero TV show, The Daybreak Squadron. One of the members, Magnus, aka Cinderborn, was formerly a member of the Sinwish Syndicate, who left to become a hero in training after reading about the Nameless's adventures in Fluffy Across the Blue, so he's a big fan of the Astral Express, and also one of Asheville's acquaintances through the Sinwish Syndicate. After some robo-battles, the crew left to meet with Pearl, who wanted to discuss both the Anti-Destruction Alliance and the current state of the Phantasmoon games. That's when the Trailblazers said that they want to win the game so they can ask Aha to lead the Alliance, and Pom Pom thought this would be a very easy thing to do since Aha has an outstanding IOU with the Astral Express. Pearl was amenable to the idea, although she plans to win for her own reasons. But thoughts of winning aside, they needed to resolve their Herald of Death issue first, so she suggested hosting a massive event, Star Rail Fest, to lure them out of hiding. She also gave Asheville some intel on the Herald of Death privately so he could continue his investigation. This included his name, Marcus Antali, and occupation, researcher for the Intelligentsia Guild. Now at the time, Asheville couldn't do much with that information, but he was able to connect the Herald of Death to the Research Society of Happy Smiles and its founder, Fulwish, so that was the lead he pursued first. And as he and Kuchiba confronted Fulwish, Asheville had a hunch that Fulwish was secretly a supplicant of the Phantasmoon games, so he located Magnus, who was also a Society member, and cornered him for questioning. Magnus revealed that every Society member undergoes happiness surgery, which is basically just the process of injecting bits of Shuhu's flesh behind their eyes with needles, but we're going to talk more about that later. The point is, this surgery affects the brain and makes people feel happy and suppresses negative feelings of anxiety and fear and all that kind of stuff. Now, Magnus hadn't had the surgery yet, but the other 3 members of the Daybreak Squadron had, and that made them extensions of Shuhu because they had Shuhu cells in them. And because Shuhu is the real supplicant here, anyone with a bit of Shuhu's flesh in him can both wear and draw wish power from the mask. And that's why Blade's been a bit restless since he got to Planarcadia. He was the original host of Shuhu's flesh, so while he didn't undergo happiness surgery, he's kind of catching strays. So Fulwish had been trying to use the Society to make the Astral Express look bad and paint them as an enemy. And since the Daybreak Squadron was part of the Society, they attacked the Nameless with a giant mecha pom-pom. But in the process, their power went a little haywire, and that forced Asheville to unseal the fragment of Ouroboros in his arm, and that tore a rift into the world on canvas, causing all of the combatants to crash land in Terminal Station, where it's revealed that the 3 Daybreak Squadron members who had undergone happiness surgery were responsible for murdering everyone at the Sinwish Syndicate HQ, including Scott. And they were unable to feel remorse or guilt or anything else because the happiness surgery dulled every emotion inside of them except for happiness. So Asheville passed judgment on them using his arm, but left Magnus alone because he wasn't part of it. Now apparently, thousands of years ago, Aha themselves sealed the remains of Ouroboros, the Veracity, within the confines of the world on canvas. And ever since then, the Phantasmoon games has been used as a sort of ritual to keep the seal on Ouroboros intact. Terminal Station appears to be a place very close to where that seal is located. Crashing into it seems to have disturbed the seal a little bit, causing the remains to grow a bit restless, which in turn makes them bite a bunch of holes into the real world, which is probably why they look like mouths. Fortunately, Pearl managed to mend all of the rifts before anyone got hurt. Then she extracted everyone from the terminal station canvas and proceeds to sum up all of the case findings thus far. But before anyone could even catch their breath, the Phantasmoon announced that there was a change to the prize at the end of the Phantasmoon games. The winning supplicant would no longer just get a minute of Eonhood, they would instead become the Eon of Elation themselves. And that is where we find ourselves at the start of this brand new quest, which means it's time for us to finally start recapping the events of the current quest. Now, normally I like to go in order here, but this quest starts with a conversation about what happened with the Phantasmoon, and that discussion kind of requires some contextual information from events that happen later in the quest, so we're gonna just skip this for now and focus mostly on Fulwish. But don't worry, we'll come back to this. Just before the fight against the Daybreak Squadron, Fulwish had launched a smear campaign against the Astral Express, leading many Planarcadians to believe, falsely, that the Trailblazer is somehow the new Herald of Death, and that they're supported by the IPC. So Pearl's kinda gonna need to keep her distance for a while so that their partnership doesn't feed into this rumor mill. So now the Nameless, operating independently, decide to focus their attention on dealing with Fulwish, and that means solving the mystery surrounding the Herald of Death and the Happiness Surgery. Now it turns out that Himiko happens to know a lot more about the Herald of Death than we were led to believe. She even confirms that Marcus and Holly turned flesh into his living artwork, and that he claimed to have witnessed a brilliant golden tree promising everlasting life. And she says that this tree's blossoms were the source of his bloody blooms. Apparently, he seemed to believe that slaughtering people would help the tree blossom more and bring about an immortality miracle. Himiko then concludes that Fulwish might essentially be the will of the abundance that possessed Marcus and Holly, but reborn. But to figure out how that could have happened, the Nameless decide to ask Fulwish's former teachers at Graphia Academy about both Fulwish and the incident 15 years ago. The only teacher with useful information is Miss Dolly, who tells us that after graduation, Fulwish got a job with the IPC and spent some time off planet before returning to Planarcadia to take over the nearly bankrupt Seafeld TV, which she rebranded to Fulwish TV. Digging through the school's archives to follow the lead reveals that Fulwish actually ended up at the Institute of Cognitive Science on the Garden Star of Botanical Study, which is more than fitting for the current situation. See, after the Bloodstained Games, Fulwish had contracted a very rare condition called happiness syntax, which allowed her to not only sense the desires of others, but if she verbalized them, her target would experience delirious hallucinations. Now, this condition had affected her anterior cingulate cortex, and fun fact, the ACC is in charge of deciding how your brain allocates attention, and wish power comes from attention. It also assists with decision-making, emotional responses, and impulse control, so you can see why this happiness syntax has the effects it does and why Fulwish would want to go into cognitive science in the first place. But there is more to it than that. See, happiness syntax is a wish power-based ability, and there's this readable available this patch, which explains that wish power is not an elation-based phenomenon, it's actually another name for the prima mobile. That's the phenomenon that binds an Eon to their respective path, and also the driving force that pushes people to become Pathstriders. But because wish power is defined as attention, that means that the prima mobile is also just attention, which in the realm of quantum physics is something we call observation. We don't really have time to sink our teeth into this idea for right now, but I will be releasing a separate video explaining how all of this works in much greater detail because this has a lot of really fun implications that I definitely want to talk about. But all we really need to know for right now is that Fulwish was likely researching the prima mobile, especially the prima mobile of the abundance path. But for one reason or another, she ended up developing the theory behind happiness surgery in the process. Now, whether that was because she somehow got access to Marcus and Holly's old research documents or Asat Pramad meddled with her in some way, I'm not really sure. As far as I know, this is all the supplemental information we can get for right now. And the only way we can get more information is to ask Fulwish directly. So that's what we're gonna do next, right after we pay the classroom crime scene a quick visit. And coincidentally, Fulwish is also there. And she uses this opportunity to broadcast her roll call and officially enter the Phantasmoon Games as a supplicant. She then invites the Nameless and all other supplicants to a televised debate at Fulwish TV, and the supplicants have no choice but to accept the invitation. But that doesn't mean they have to attend unprepared. After all, Fulwish herself had given them somewhat of a new lead by telling them that she was once mailed a mask by the Elation themselves, which Himiko interprets as the tavern having invited Fulwish into their ranks as a masked fool. However, there's not really enough time for the Nameless to conduct the investigation themselves. They need to get to the debate stage, and quickly. So they ask Sparxie to investigate the masked fool lead and the tavern on their behalf. And we'll come back to her investigation a little bit later. Now, the debate is happening at Fulwish TV Tower, which is located in nearby Seafeld City. But Seafeld City is a little different from Duo Mention City, in that it is kind of entirely enemy territory. See, the results of a separate investigation conducted by Evanescia and Yao Guang revealed that nearly everyone in the city had undergone happiness surgery. And that's why Yao Guang's divination showed everyone within Seafeld City as having a wheel fortune, or a fortune of good fortune. See, happiness surgery creates a type of Mara-struck individual who is truly immortal and can therefore survive almost any kind of apocalypse, but at the cost of their humanity. So on the one hand, they can't really experience a woe divination, because they can't suffer on account of them only being able to feel happiness, and they can't die because they are immortal due to the abundance. The problem is, though, that all of these people who have had happiness surgery are just one step away from becoming denizens of abundance, which are things that Lan, the hunt, loves to shoot. So if Lan casts their gaze towards Planarcadia and then finds Shuhu spawn everywhere, they might just blow up the whole planet. And that's a bit of a problem. So we kinda need to put a stop to it. And the person who could do that is Evanescia, because Evanescia is kind of like the Phantasmoon game's umpire, which means it's her job to enforce the rules of the game and punish those who violate them. However, when she tries to use her Sword of Law Enforcement, not the official name, she realizes that Fulwish isn't a supplicant at all and is therefore not subject to the rules. She then confirms that the real supplicant is Shuhu, and since his flesh had been transplanted into the 200,000 happiness surgery recipients, passing judgment on him would result in thousands of people being executed as collateral damage. And while Evanescia has no desire to slaughter innocent people in the name of the Phantasmoon games, her altar would have no such qualms. So they need to find an alternative solution, and fast. And that's when Danheng, Ashvale, and Blade show up with a solution to this dilemma. Blade was already a relatively stable host of Shuhu, so if they can find a way to extract and fuse all of Shuhu's bits together, then he can serve as the sole target of Evanescia's judgment, eliminating Shuhu once and for all. And as Blade is explaining the situation regarding Shuhu's connection to the happiness surgery, Yao Guang asks a very important question. Who brought Shuhu's flesh to Planarcadia in the first place? Here's the thing. This question does not get answered in the quest itself. It only gets answered in a follow-up side quest that unlocks after the main mission finishes. So let's pause the main quest for a second and fill in these blanks. So in this post-mission quest, Pearl asks Silverwolf to investigate how the Sinwish Syndicate originally obtained the supplicant mask that Sunday is currently using. But Silverwolf also wants to figure out who orchestrated the murder of the Sinwish Syndicate and Scott. Now, obviously the Daybreak Squadron did the deed, but someone had to put them up to it. And as far as we know, it actually wasn't Fulwish. Now, serendipitously, Yao Guang had asked Ting Yun to look into how Shuhu's flesh actually arrived on Planarcadia in the first place, because technically, Shuhu's flesh was supposed to be inside of a locked box inside of the shackling prison on the Luofu. And if someone managed to get it out of the shackling prison, then the Xianzhou has a pretty big problem. And if they got it from somewhere else, that's still a problem, but a different problem. Now, the investigations of Silverwolf and Ting Yun have a lot of overlap, so they decide to collaborate. And of course, the Trailblazer is along for the ride. Ting Yun happens to have a lead via a business card for Noctis Trading that she found within Fulwish's possessions. So Ting Yun infiltrates their headquarters so Silverwolf can swipe their data. And in that data are a bunch of records, shipping logs, transaction history, that kind of stuff. And within those records, one name stands out amongst them all. Gillam Quenmere from the Intelligentsia Guild. Apparently, this guy was responsible for smuggling Shuhu's flesh into Planarcadia 15 years ago, but then he smuggled it back out after the Herald of Death incident. But he apparently didn't get it all because when he heard about Fulwish's happiness surgery, he returned to Planarcadia to hunt down the remaining flesh. That means that Fulwish likely developed the theory of happiness surgery while still on Garden Star. But when she returned to Planarcadia, she stumbled upon or located or hunted down the remnants of Shuhu's flesh that didn't get smuggled back out of Planarcadia after the Bloodstained Games. And that is presumably how Fulwish arrived at the finalized version of happiness surgery. Now, Gillum is just a grunt, not the boss, so this investigation into who's pulling whose strings isn't over yet. But the lead Gillum provides is kind of dead because he's also dead. Apparently he was murdered that morning, and that intel is courtesy of Ashvale and Kuchiba, who are also conducting a separate but related investigation. Now, before he died, he sent a bunch of highly encrypted self-destructing messages to Pearl's direct office line, suggesting that Pearl had some sort of connection with him. So that's one new lead. And while Ashvale and Kuchiba can't actually investigate the rest of this themselves because they'll draw too much attention to the IPC's involvement in the case, they do happen to leave behind Scott's computer for Silverwolf to sift through. And this allows her to find a lead that ties back to someone who actually witnessed the Sinwish Syndicate massacre. This witness claims that the Sinwish Syndicate had actually gotten their supplicant mask from Scott, so that's one mystery solved. And then she gives them the surveillance footage from the day the massacre occurred. That's when they find out that Scott was actually a mole in the Strategic Investment Department, as was the person who orchestrated the massacre, Pearl's secretary, Mia. Turns out both Mia and Scott worked for the Marketing and Development Department, and 15 years ago, their boss asked them to smuggle in some bioweapons into Planarcadia, just to cause some trouble, you know? They're trying to mess with Pearl's setup. But at some point during the transport process, the bioweapons were actually swapped with Shuhu's flesh, which means that the Marketing and Development Department was not responsible for bringing Shuhu's flesh into Planarcadia in the first place. Somebody else was. Now, I've seen a lot of speculation on who could have done this swap. The two most obvious suspects are Yabuli, who received all of Marcus and Tali's possessions, and Asap Pramad, who is at least partly responsible for pulling Fulwish's strings. But there is a third suspect that I never even considered until I saw other people talking about it, and that suspect is Ryusuke. Keep in mind that Ryusuke was trying to prevent his daughter from dying from a curse, so pursuing some sort of solution within the domain of abundance would make sense. I encourage you to read some of the other theories that have been written about it, because it would be one heck of a cool plot twist if they turn out to be true. But for now at least, this is all just speculation. The real culprit could be any one of these three suspects or a new suspect entirely. We don't know yet, and we're probably not going to find out until at least next patch. But before we go back to the main quest and continue with the debate against Fulwish, let's turn our attention to the other investigation that we had ongoing. You know, the one where we asked Sparxie to investigate whether or not Fulwish was actually a masked fool. So Sparxie's investigation is pretty straightforward. All she has to do is walk around the tavern and ask different people whether or not they knew Fulwish and if they'd seen her around. This lands her at the clinic, where she learns more about Fulwish's happiness syntax ability and how it drives people into madness. And then she gets to experience it firsthand after a run-in with Fulwish herself. Now, Sparxie is kind of the embodiment of weaponized madness, so she was definitely the best person to send into this fight in particular, because she actually has the wherewithal to break free from Fulwish's grasp. But as soon as she does, she finds herself faced with an even more dangerous enemy. The true mastermind behind everything, Mr. Meanie. Now, unfortunately, we don't get to witness this interaction between Sparxie and Mr. Meanie, so we'll have to come back to him later, because if we don't want to be late for the debate against Fulwish, we've got to leave right now. Although, I guess there's not really any point on whether we're early or late, because Fulwish started this so-called debate long before the scheduled time. And of course, her opening argument is just slander. She's just spewing information about members of the Astral Express without providing any contextual information at all. And this framing paints several nameless as wanted criminals, giving her the perfect excuse to blame her own crime of infecting people with the power of the abundance on the nameless and the IPC by association. Then she outs Sunday's location, because remember, he's supposed to be secretly on the run, and then claims that his harmony power is causing the abundance infection to become contagious. What's worse is that this lie of hers is believable because her happiness syntax activates the bits of Shuhu flesh inside of the infected, causing them to mutate into the abominations of abundance right at that moment. And I'm talking all 200,000 of them. It's a horrible thing to do, but it's definitely extremely well coordinated. Now, while all this is going on, Pearl and Silverwolf work together to locate the source of the Joy Ascendant contagion to see if they can shut down the transmission signal. This is the thing that's causing the happiness surgery recipients to mutate. And while the name sounds pretty fancy, it's really just Fulwish's happiness syntax that's been weaponized and then broadcast. And because it's a wish power based ability, it can easily mess with the Imaginae and send them into a frenzy because Imaginae are made of wish power, and when you send contaminated wish power into beings made of wish power, you kinda mess them up a bit, you know? But when regular people come in contact with the happiness syntax, it actually targets their synesthesia beacons, which, if you didn't know, is this little microchip that's in the back of the neck that auto-translates languages both heard and spoken, and most people seem to have one. The synesthesia beacon is obviously connected to the recipient's brain, and that's how the happiness syntax kind of messes with people's minds, right? So when normal people hear the happiness syntax, they just go a little bit nuts because their synesthesia beacons are going a little bit haywire. But when a recipient of happiness surgery hears it, the signals sent by the synesthesia beacon because of the happiness syntax triggers something within Shuhu's cells that are inside of their brains that cause them to mutate into Joy Ascendants. Now, because Blade also possesses some Shuhu flesh inside of him, he falls into the same category as the other happiness surgery recipients, but unlike them, Blade is very aware of his own circumstances, so when he heard the broadcast and started to feel the effects, he stabbed himself with the remnants of his shard sword. The resulting pain was enough to keep him focused and prevent him from mutating. Now, obviously, defeating Fulwish will stop the broadcast, but Pearl suspects quite rightly that Fulwish is not the only person responsible for the broadcast, so she sends Silverwolf to investigate. Now, Kafka makes a brief appearance to pass along a message to Silverwolf, but she's a bit late, meaning something has gone wrong with Elio's script, and that puts Silverwolf on high alert. So she quickly realizes that someone has hijacked her communications with Pearl during her investigations while inside Planarcadia's internet, and that someone just so happens to be our buddy Mr. Meanie, who is also the one manipulating Fulwish from the shadows. Mr. Meanie seems to be under the impression that he can write a script just like Elio can, and it looks like he can at the very least tamper with it, but Silverwolf has no interest in entertaining his delusions, and even threatens to lock him in the Dark Zone, which is something I'd love to talk more about since we got a bunch of readables on the subject, but the Dark Zone isn't super relevant for this quest's events, so I have to leave it for another time. Now, while Silverwolf is dealing with Mr. Meanie, the streets of Planarcadia are embroiled in chaos, so we've got to shut down that broadcast, and quick. Now, the broadcast is coming from the top of Seafeld TV Tower, so the Trailblazer and co. race to the top of the tower and find Blade and Don Hung waiting for them. And this is a good thing because Blade is the key to victory here, since apart from Fulwish, he is the only one who can currently withstand the happiness syntax while also tapping into the power of Shuhu's supplicant mask. So all they need to do now is find a way to seize the mask from Fulwish and give it to Blade. But before they can do that, they are surrounded by meanie kitties, and these are just Imaginae that are born from the synesthesia beacons of the infected individuals, and they represent their individual supplicant masks, if you will. If you watched the last recap episode, you may remember me describing Shuhu as a Jinmenju, a yokai with 1,000 flowers shaped like human heads that laugh uncontrollably until they die. Meanie kitties are basically these flower heads. And since each meanie kitty represents a fragment of Shuhu, who is the main supplicant, the meanie kitties can and do start fusing together to form one giant meanie kitty smiley face thing that apparently wants to replace the Phantasmoon. I feel like that should have wider implications, but they're never addressed. Silverwolf makes quick work of this little fusion by borrowing the power of her future self and hacking the beacons of all 200,000 Shuhu supplicants, but it's only a temporary fix until they can take out Fulwish. She sends the crew on ahead while she stays behind to deal with the big meanie. I mean, Mr. Meanie, the daddy of all the mini-meanies. And Mr. Meanie's real identity is Asat Pramad, the emanator of destruction, who is targeting the Elation. He doesn't reveal too much in this interaction, but there is a lot of evidence scattered throughout this patch for us to piece together a rough picture of his plan. But stick with me, because this is still highly speculative. So as a destruction emanator that's targeting the Path of Elation, we know that Asat's main goal is to destroy the Path of Elation and Aha along with it. And we know that the best, if not the only way to destroy an Eon is by using the power of another Eon. And lucky for him, the Eon Ouroboros is sealed within the world on canvas, so we can assume that he intends to break the seal on Ouroboros so it can, at the very least, destroy Planarcadia by eating it. And maybe eventually it'll try to eat the entire Path of Elation. I don't really know how that's gonna go. But I got to thinking about this because when we arrived at Terminal Station, which is apparently a spot that's pretty close to the location where Ouroboros is, all of these rifts started appearing across Duomension City, and those rifts look just like mouths. So it's possible that the seal on Ouroboros is getting a bit weak, and they started eating whatever they could reach. So those rifts were their bite marks. Now, if I were a Asat Pramod and I wanted to break the seal on Ouroboros, I would probably want to know what the seal is first. And I'm pretty sure at this point that the seal on Ouroboros is Evanescia herself, but more specifically, her main body, the Planarch Elwood. Because the girl we meet is technically an Imaginate that was born from the tree when people offered it wish power, and she can only manifest in this form during the Phantasmoon games. At every other time, she reverts into her tree form and sleeps until the next round of the games. Now, the purpose of the Phantasmoon games is to keep the seal functional, and if Evanescia is part of the seal and the games are part of the ritual that maintains the seal, then it would make perfect sense for Evanescia to be both the arbiter of the games and the guardian of the seal. For all the reasons listed, I believe, but cannot currently confirm, that Aha trapped Ouroboros within the world on canvas, then sealed its exit with the Planarch Elwood, because a denizen of abundance is effectively immortal, so it could provide an infinite source of food for the Eon of Veracity, or more specifically, the wish power within the tree would be drip-fed to the Eon. This is essentially an unstoppable force meeting an immovable object, and I find that very Aha core for some reason. But if true, then this relationship would form a very delicate balance, and Aha would need to ensure that the scales never tipped in favor of Ouroboros. So, the Phantasmoon games are held whenever the Planarch Elwood needs more wish power in order to sustain or replenish itself. After all, the purpose of the games is to generate a massive amount of wish power, and I'd wager that the reason the wish power requirements vary so much from game to game is because the amount of energy Evanescia spends reinforcing and sustaining the seal every time varies depending on how much wish power Ouroboros has consumed. Now, this theory would also explain why Evanescia claims that joining the games as a supplicant will drain her strength. As long as she's manifesting outside the tree and participating in the games, then she's spending wish power on the miracles of the games and not using it to reinforce the seal. That would cause the seal to grow weak, and that is exactly what Asat Pramod wants. Which is why it makes sense that she would accuse him of being the one to enroll her as a supplicant in the first place. Asat Pramod's manipulation of Fulwish also kind of starts to make sense in this light, because the more chaos he sows using the games, the more wish power Evanescia would likely have to spend. Fulwish herself even claims that she wants to create a never-ending Phantasmoon game, which means she's essentially trying to trap everyone inside of her miracle. And if you have a never-ending game, then you have a situation where the wish power never goes back to the seal to reinforce it. Now, all that said, this is not a perfect theory. There are some things that go against this or don't quite make sense. For example, Asat Pramod was likely the one responsible for making the Phantasmoon speak, and that generated a massive amount of wish power. It seems to me that generating massive amounts of wish power probably isn't a great way to further his goals of depriving the seal of wish power, the way I've laid it out. But I don't know, maybe the wish power accumulates on the moon, and maybe Ouroboros will see the moon as a very tasty snack when they break free. A giant leviathan swallowing the moon would be a terrifying sight, and would deprive the people of Planarcadia with their ability to manifest things using wish power, so maybe that's the goal. I don't know. I'm working with what I've got, which really isn't much. Regardless of what exactly Asat Pramod's plan is, the goal of our protagonists remains unchanged for now. We still need to take out Fulwish, and we also need to neutralize Shuhu. When confronted, Fulwish shares her gruesome memories of the bloodstained games and the media exploitation of her experiences that followed. And while there should have been an opportunity at this point to give her a chance to make things right again, Fulwish has no interest in that. She's already undergone happiness surgery herself, and she triggers her own transformation by using happiness syntax on herself, thus fusing with the main body of Shuhu. And the fight that follows this fusion is a tough one. One hit from mutated Fulwish and the Trailblazer is flung off the tower. And as they plunge to their death, their mind projects into the Phantasmoon courtyard where they meet Evanescia's altar. As a failsafe, Evanescia broke the one rule of the Phantasmoon games. You know, the one that says you can't stop the games. Apparently just sharing information about the true purpose of the games and the eons sealed within the canvas is enough to break that rule. And this rule breaking woke her alternate self. And should the Trailblazer fail to stop Fulwish and Shuhu, her alter would then pass judgment on Shuhu and his 200,000 fragments, so the games can get back on track. 200,000 lives is apparently a small price to pay for keeping an eon sealed. But the Trailblazer manages to convince her to wait for just 3 more minutes. And in those 3 minutes, the Trailblazer calls upon the wish power from all the Planarcadians who still believe in the Astral Express, and that wish power reshapes their mask and weapons into bigger, stronger forms. And I just want to remind you that a couple patches back, Himiko mentioned that there are 3 stages that a supplicant must complete in order to actually be qualified to win the game. The first is a roll call, the second is a miracle, and the third is called promotion and was never actually defined. But I think this transformation stage might actually be the promotion stage. I could be wrong, but it would make sense if that were the case. Regardless, this freshly enhanced Trailblazer manages to take Fulwish out with a single strike, but the bulk of Shuhu's body still remains. And if they don't deal with that, Planarcadia will soon be overrun by the abundance, and maybe blown up by Lan. So Blade proposes a solution. As the original host of Shuhu, he could gather the rest of Shuhu's remains into himself and contain it. And although Blade's always appeared to be a bit unstable, he has managed to keep himself and Shuhu's power in check for decades. So this is probably the safest choice. And sure, Blade's stable state is mostly due to Kafka using Spirit Whisper on him. And there is a risk that without Kafka around to use Spirit Whisper, that Blade could, absorb all of Shuhu's fragments and then go berserk. But this is where Sunday is actually pretty helpful, because he has a thought tuning ability that we could use instead. Although rather than use tuning on Blade, Sunday decides to try and use tuning on all 200,000 infected individuals, stabilizing their thoughts prior to merging them into Blade. So as I understand it, Sunday basically used tuning to pluck out all of the fears and anxieties that Fulwish had exploited when convincing people to get happiness surgery, and because those fears were tied to Shuhu's cells, Sunday was basically able to tug those fears and Shuhu's cells out of their brains like threads, where he then calmed them down and wove them into a condensed ball. Those threads then became thorns that Dan Heng and Blade plunged into the giant Shuhu flower on top of Seafeld Tower, which allowed all of the bits to merge together to create a fully revived Shuhu in the form of an enormous tree in the sky. Silverwolf then used ether editing to condense the tree into a tiny little file which she shoved into Blade for safekeeping, while Dan Heng helped keep Blade stable and focused. When all is said and done, Yao Guang finally arrives at the tower and thanks Blade for saving the people of Planarcadia. She also offers him a way to achieve the peaceful death that he's always wanted as a reward. But what I find most interesting about this offer of hers is that she seems to think that Ouroboros is the key to his death, or at least that the veracity can serve as a means for Blade to exact revenge on Shuhu. So the two of them leave for the world on canvas. Everyone else heads back to their home bases except for the Trailblazer, who leaves to meet up with Evanescia instead, and she has something quite interesting to say. Not only did Evanescia know Graphia, but the two had fought alongside each other during the invasion of the Legion thousands of years ago, and they also fought against Asat Pramad. Well, allegedly. But the craziest thing she says is that Graphia is still alive after all this time. She's been hibernating in the depths of the world on canvas ever since she first sealed Planarcadia within it, and Evanescia thinks it's time to wake her up. So now we have 2 reasons to go into the world on canvas next patch. But this got me wondering about something. What if Graphia herself is the source of her family's weathering curse? Okay, there's this one readable that posits the theory that Graphia might actually be sustaining the world on canvas using her own life force, and the life force of her family. And if that's true, that means either the life force of her family is being fed directly into the canvas, or she's extending her own life by draining the life force of her descendants. It's interesting to think of it this way because the only person within Graphia's lineage who has come close to breaking the curse apart from Himiko, who is still an unknown, was Nephia, who circumvented the curse's effects by consuming the lives of other people. But if this really is how the curse works, then what exactly did Himiko do during the games 15 years ago that produced an even more effective result? And I want to point out one other thing that's a little bit weird that may or may not tie into this, and it comes from another readable that became available this patch. Do you guys remember the name that Himiko scribbled out in the Astral Express's visitor log? They only told us it was Mura at first, but everyone knew it was Murata because that is the last name of the Himiko that you find in Honkai Impact 3rd. And it turns out that in this game, Murata is actually the name of the tower that Graphia was said to have descended from back when Planarcadia was still Benzai Tengoku. And the existence of this crazy tower seems to feed into a bunch of other legends that you find in other readables, some of which seem to have a connection to the Astral Express. So it is possible that this so-called Tower of Murata is actually one of the Astral Express train cars that crash-landed in Planarcadia. And if that's the case, then Graphia may have originally been a nameless. And there's a distinct possibility that Himiko may have managed to heal herself by binding herself directly to that train car. Hence why she tried to sign her name as Murata initially. But that is still just speculation, but interesting speculation that I want you to pay attention to. We'll see how it pans out. Now, hopefully the next patch is going to give us a lot of the answers we've been looking for, since we have to go wake up Graphia at Evanesia's behest, and we also have to venture into the depths of the canvas to help with Blade's rebirth. And I say rebirth instead of death because there's no way he's actually dying for real. I mean, the guy's got a new playable form that's coming out next patch, and it is Phoenix coded to hell and back. This boy's gonna be reborn from his own ashes, I swear. I don't see how it could be anything but that. I don't know what Ouroboros has to do with this, but I'm very interested to find out. But speaking of death by Ouroboros, I do also want to point out that there is something very weird going on with Kuchiba that doesn't seem to actually be tied to the abundance like I was originally suspecting it was. Because at the very end of the quest, she has a confrontation with Pearl, and that is littered with the same eyeball imagery that we see on Ashvale. And we can link him directly back to Ouroboros. So it's very possible that Kuchiba has some connection to the Veracity. She also appears to be some kind of double agent that's working for the Department of Aberration Defense, and also as someone who is investigating the IPC's ambitions on Planarcadia, which she believes are not tied to the Elation at all, but to the Veracity. And that brings us to the end of a very lengthy recap video. Apologies for the length, but obviously we had a lot to cover. Will all these mini theories come true in the next patch? Well, tune in next time to find out. Thank you all so much for watching, and I will see you in the next episode. Take care of yourselves, and bye-bye for now.